Hi, welcome to my kitchen. My name is Ann White and I want to show you how you can make a 1-gallon recipe of mead. Mead is a honey wine, and a honey wine is as simple as honey and water. When you make mead, just like anything you make yourself, because you do it yourself, you can control how strong it is, how sweet it is, whether it's carbonated, whether you add herbs, spices, all kinds of different things you can add to it. At its simplest, though, it's just honey and water. So what I've got going is a 2-pound jar of local honey, which is great. A couple, 20 minutes ago, this was more solid, and when it was solid, it would have been harder to pour out of the jar. So one of the first things I did when I came into the kitchen was I just got this jar melting in a little hot water so that I could do a nice pour like that. So right now for a gallon of mead, I'm actually going to make a little more than a gallon. I'm going to make about 1.25 gallons or 1.33 gallons of mead. And I'll show you why later. Right now, I want to add my variation to this batch of mead. And one of the things I'm going to make is a rosehip mead. So I'm going to measure out 1 ounce of dried rose hips. And it's always nice to measure just because I'll know I'll get the same results every time, just like in baking. And I'm going to put them in a bag and tie the bag off. I'm just going to put this in the honey while it's heating up, and I'm going to basically sterilize it just by heating it up. And so all I want to do is get this up 150, 160, something like that. And it might, depending on the flame and how much liquid you've got, could take different amounts of time. The color is starting to come out of the rose hips in the bag, and it's going to have a real pretty pink, almost, I'm hoping to have like a blush colored mead, or Hidromiel. That's the version that it's called. But pretty much, I'll just occasionally stir it, make sure nothing's going to boil over, and that's easy. Anybody can do that.
While the honey and water mixture steeps on the stove, the equipment used for the fermenting process can be sanitized and rinsed.
One of the things that can be a little intimidating about home brewing is you'll hear us talk a lot about how things have to be sanitized and how important it is to keep everything clean. Don't think it's too hard to do. It's as simple as a tablespoon of bleach and 1 gallon of water. You rinse everything, make sure everything is soaked, and as long as you're conscientious about making sure everything has come into contact with the sanitizer, then no worries at all. Everything will be fine. If I was a canner, I'd be using boiling water, but it's just not practical for brewing with all the plastic and glass that we use. So usually a tablespoon of bleach per gallon of water is the cheapest, easiest, and safest way to sanitize your equipment.
After a quick rinse of all the equipment, the mead mixture has reached a temperature of 160 degrees and is ready for the fermentation process.
So everything can go in, even the bag, because I would expect during the time it's fermenting, I'll get even more color and flavor from the dried rose hips. So I've got this in a bucket. The black strip is a thermometer strip because now I'm going to add cold water that I had in the refrigerator, which is colder than my tap water right now. And it's bottled water because there's chlorine in my water, so I'd like to make my mead without chlorine in it. So I'm looking to get this, if I can, up to my volume, which is something under 1.5 gallons, and see if I can't get the temperature strip to show me 65 to 75 degrees. And then I'll add the yeast. But just like in baking, if I were to add the yeast right now, if it was too hot, game over. No yeast, no fermentation. And it looks like we're just about there. I'm at 68 degrees, and so I'm not going to kill the yeast. It's the same as the room temperature, so looks like we're good to add the yeast. But first, I want to do one thing. I want to blend it together because I want to take a hydrometer reading. And that's not complicated, but it is a piece of equipment that most brewers have. It measures the density. So right now it's going to measure how much sugar there is. When the sugar ferments, that's where the alcohol comes from. So if I want to know how strong my mead's going to be, I need to take a reading. I'm going to pour into the cylinder until the hydrometer floats. And because this isn't going back into the fermenter, I don't really need to worry about this being sanitized. Now that I've got the hydrometer floating, I can see I'm just at 8% potential alcohol. So when my mead is finished fermenting, I'll have 8% alcohol. And I can decide later if I want to have it sparkling, if I want it to be still. But I have a starting reading, so now I know how strong my mead's going to be.
Because the yeast will only have a diet of water and sugar, Anne likes to add half a teaspoon of yeast nutrient, which is basically a vitamin for the yeast.
There's the yeast going in.
As soon as the liquid yeast is added, the container is covered and sealed.
You always want to make sure you don't get any fruit flies or any dust or anything in your mead when it's getting ready to ferment, during fermentation, really at any time. You always have what's called an airlock on top. Beer brewers, winemakers, cider makers all use one of these. There's two styles, but this one is a two-piece. The water that's in here is going to be a vent so that the CO2, once the yeast starts to ferment, it's going to make CO2 gas, and that's got to have a way to release, otherwise the lid would come off. But you also want to make sure that all the curious fruit flies, dust, anything that might get in and ruin your mead doesn't get in. So it's a barrier and it's a vent. And at some point in the next day or two, I'll notice this middle piece just sort of gently bobbing up and down, and that's going to tell me, without even looking inside, that there's gas escaping, that fermentation has started. And at that point, it's just a question of giving it enough time until I take another hydrometer reading. When the hydrometer reads 0% potential alcohol, then I'll know that the 8% potential be turned into 8% real alcohol, and it'll be ready to move to the next step, which is a glass jug. Since I made more than a gallon, I'll be able to nicely fill it up, and that's where it's going to stay until it's clear enough and I decide it's tasty enough that I want to bottle it. And that's the next thing we'll talk about.
A bottle of grapefruit mead that Anne made a year ago was ready for bottling. Using a siphon is the easiest and cleanest way to bottle.
So I'm going to take a sample in a glass for me, and I'm going to go back and just hold that tip up to keep it out of the sediment. I did disturb it a little bit, but that's okay. Mead making's getting more popular. It's a great hobby. There are books now about mead making that have been written in the last 5 years that bring a more up-to-date focus on techniques and the new ingredients and modern winemaking ideas to the process. There are some great old books out there too. Anytime you've got questions, if there's a local store, local homebrew shop you can go to, those folks are usually going to be friendly wherever you are, and they'll be happy to answer your questions.
Once all the bottles are full, they're ready to be capped.
That's it. It's ready to taste and it's ready to share. So this is a bottle of cider, which is honey mead made with cider instead of water for it. And funny enough, as soon as I opened it and they heard the cork, I have two new friends. Neil and Ron are here to have a glass of cider with me. Because honestly, pouring and sharing what you made yourself and serving it with folks that can appreciate it is what it's all about. Cheers.
Cheers. Skull.
Skull.